I'm Tori Bedford. Tonight on Greater Boston, sky-high rents and home prices are driving Bostonians out of the area. We'll hear from one of them. Plus, why are the 80s and 90s still so impactful in 2024? We'll take a stroll down memory lane with the co-host of the In Retrospect podcast. And finally, a performance from the nearly 50-year-old Takish Quartet, now on tour with their latest work. Nearly $125,000. That's an annual salary you need to live alone comfortably in Boston, factoring the rising cost of living, plus money for savings and a few nights out. That's well above the median household income in Boston at around $90,000, and that gap is forcing a lot of people out. According to a new survey from the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, an alarming 25% of residents between the ages of 20 and 30 plan to leave the area over the next 5 years. Esvin Yankor is one of those residents. He joins me now along with Steve Meacham, Boston lead organizer with City Life Vida Urbana. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. So Esvin, can you just begin by sharing your story? You were living in East Boston and you started to feel a lot of the pressures around the cost of just being here, right, with your family.
Correct. Yes. I was living in East Boston probably about more than 20 years, but on the last apartment that I was living about 17 years, and we were paying our rent on time. Everything was fine. Even in COVID times, we never failed to pay on time. And then things started to happen. The landlord first told me that they were going to increase the rent, but my worry was they were going to increase it too much, like they did the last time they did, like about 35%. And then after that, they say they will not increase it, but they send me an eviction notice.
Oh, wow.
And then after that, that's when I was able to contact City Life Vida Urbana, and then they helped me through all these troubled times to try to get an agreement with the landlord. And eventually we got to an agreement, and I had to move out and literally out of the city.
So where do you live now?
First we moved to Lynn. Now I'm living in Malden. But at that time we were literally displaced because we're a family, and then we had to go to different places.
Yeah, you're talking about your wife and your son, right?
My son and my mother.
Oh, your mother, okay.
My mother and my niece. Mm-hmm.
And so are you together now in Malden?
No, literally we're displaced because we have to find rooms on different places in order for us to be able to live. But still trying to get an apartment. So
you're all living in single rooms in different places?
Correct.
Yeah. Correct. Do you miss what you had in East Boston?
Oh, of course. It's because I've been there for more than 20 years, and everything was pretty much closed. My work was closed, and we consider it a very safe place for us. But unfortunately, right now, we need rent control so that to keep families together. Yeah. That's because they literally displaced one family right now, and no, it's not just only us. It's more than, I would say, hundreds of families that are being displaced, especially from the Boston area.
Yeah, a lot of people are being pushed out. This this survey from the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce Foundation's Young Residents Survey, it was released earlier this month. They asked people about the factors in their decision to leave the area, and 66% said the cost of rent, 66% said job availability, and 55% said ability to buy a home. I think for a lot of people, the home buying part, for young people especially, just does not seem like a possibility in this market and with this current housing crisis that we're facing across the state. the same report said that if they asked young Greater Boston residents if they would be willing to stay or leave the area, 25% said they would be likely to leave, 65% said likely to stay, and 10% said unsure. Are you surprised at all by those results, Steve?
Not surprised at all. I mean, we have had a chapter in East Boston. I mean, Esvin's story is one of hundreds and hundreds that have come through our chapter in East Boston. And they're all examples of breakup of families, breakup of the community, and all for, basically the speculative role of the market as debt is added to buildings. It's not like your water and sewer bill is going up. That's not what's causing the rent increases. It's the accumulation of debt. And so it's the question that you raised of, can you find affordable housing? But in our efforts to keep people in the housing they're in is becoming increasingly difficult. And that's affecting not only the individuals who are being displaced, but the community too.
Yeah, it's changing the whole scope of the community. I mean, you were living in East Boston for 20 years, you said, in that same apartment for 17 years.
17 years.
So you had developed a relationship with that landlord, right?
I would think so.
Yeah. And so I wonder if you, within that 2-decade span, witnessed the neighborhood changing in a way that you felt was, oh, maybe we're getting priced out, or there are more, the demographic is changing, things around the area are changing.
Oh, definitely. Because you see new buildings coming up, and then probably about 4 or 5 years, that's when the prices are starting going up. And I have heard stories of some people that they literally did like 3 or 4 years ago what they did to us, our last landlords in East Boston, because they think that just because the new buildings are getting like a higher price, they think that the old buildings are also going to get the same price. So they are going by the market price is, but from my point of view, it shouldn't be like that, because the buildings are already there. All they have to do is maintenance.
Right.
And sometimes they don't even do maintenance too.
Well, that's something that Vita Urbana has been dealing with, not only with fighting to keep people in their homes, but also with the maintenance of these old buildings, which has been cited in multiple reports. The Boston Foundation came out with one recently that shows that home ownership, the people who actually own the homes, that demographic is aging, but the homes themselves, the infrastructure is also aging and requiring a lot of maintenance. You've been at Vita Urbana for 24 years. What do you make of this shift just in the last few years? This has been a long time coming, but I think the housing crisis now has reached this point where the state has taken some actions to address it, because it has become such a huge issue as homelessness is rising and as more and more people are at risk of homelessness or displacement within these communities.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's happening in our organizing is that we're no longer just in Boston. We're organizing tenant associations against displacement in Malden, where Esvin is now, in Medford, in Arlington, in Brockton, Lawrence. And basically, in some ways, the crisis in Boston is kind of like migrating and encompassing all the nearby suburbs. And so we're trying to organize to protect people in those suburbs now.
And what do you see as the solution here? I mean, you've been doing this work for a long time. I don't know if in the last few years you feel like you're drowning in this crisis, but what are you hoping for as you continue this work?
There's 3 things that we could do. Sometimes the displacement crisis is presented as intractable, unsolvable, just something that we'll live with. But it's not true. It's really a human-made thing. If we had rent control, which would go to scale, TOPA, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which allows tenants to buy buildings at the point of sale, and the transfer tax, which would provide the money to do that, we could make a serious dent in the displacement crisis. And in the process of doing that, we would be restoring and protecting a lot of working class communities of color.
And you, Esvin, you work, on this larger goal as well. You do advocacy. Are you hoping to get to a place where you can move back in with your family and reunite with them?
Of course, yes. That has been, after we were displaced, that has been my main goal, to get back together. But unfortunately, at the moment, I haven't been able. But let's hope that we pass a strong rent control at an affordable price, that not even the professionals that are making more than $100,000, like people like me and everybody that's being displaced, can afford it.
How do you feel that your life would be different in this, if you were able to stay with your family?
It
and
would
stay in
be a
Boston?
whole lot different because it would be less stressful. Right now, we're not living together, but I hope that we eventually get another apartment where we can all live together, and it will be less stressful and more enjoyable because families are being displaced. It's real. It's not something that someone says, oh, someone is being done as we speak at the moment. Families are being displaced, and it gets really stressful. Believe me, it gets really stressful because you start thinking a lot of things. You even think about being homeless, and even when you've been paying on time the rent, and then that comes up and it hits you like a brick, literally, because you never thought you're doing everything correct and something like that will happen.
In your conversations how old is your son?
He's about 25.
Okay, and so in your conversations with him and then with your mother, do you talk about getting back to a place where you can be together?
Yes, all the time.
Yeah.
All the time, yeah, because right now we live in different parts, so we do get together, and then we visit each other, but...
And you've applied for one.
Yeah,
okay.
And...
Well, keep us posted. Let us know how that goes.
Well, thank you.
All right. Esvin Yancour and Steve Meacham, thank you both so much.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for being
Thank
here.
you.
Pleasure.
Next up, with Mom Jean's Back in Style and Tracy Chapman's Fast Car topping the charts, it seems like America can't get over the 80s and 90s. And neither can the hosts of the podcast In Retrospect, who look back on all the pop culture trends, scandals, and questionable fashion choices that defined the era. One of them, Susie Banikarim, joins me now. Susie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I love this podcast. It's so much fun, but I also think there's a couple of threads here that I think are so important. It's really important, vital reporting. I mean, you have a long history in news and journalism, and you bring all of that into this. And I guess I just wanted to ask you, you talk at one point about this pop culture being seen as low culture or gossipy or sort of like trivia, and the way that you're looking at it and addressing it, I think you raise a lot of really important issues of kind of analyzing the past. What do you make of that? I mean, why did you decide to do this podcast about low culture?
Well, I think my career has been very focused on hard news. So for me, this is getting an opportunity to look at issues that I've always really cared about and love. I mean, I grew up on pop culture. I'm Iranian. I was born in Iran and came to this country when I was 3. So I think like a lot of immigrants, I learned what it meant to be an American from pop culture. This is how I learned about the country that I came to be part of. So for me, I think we often dismiss pop culture because it's seen as for girls or it's seen as, silly or lowbrow, but it is the way we tell our stories to each other. And the stories we choose to tell and the way we choose those stories, they tell us a lot about the time we're in and also about what we care about, So that's why we wanted to explore these issues.
And so many of these episodes are just about iconic images or themes or things that you're talking to my generation as well, growing up and just taking these things, at face value, right? Like Pamela Anderson's red swimsuit or Monica Lewinsky or Anita Hill, or, you talked about 1992 as the year of the woman while all of these horrible scandals were going on that were extremely sexist. I want to play this clip from the podcast where you're talking about Britney Spears' memoir, and I've thought so much about this lens as well, where, during her period where she shaved her head, everyone was making a big joke out of it. And now years and years later, we see her struggle really, right? Like through her own words, or at least the words of her and her ghostwriter. But let's hear this clip just about you're kind of analyzing the media coverage of her at the time.
If there's one thing in the book that becomes very clear, it's really how afraid of them she was, how aggressive they were with her, how much of her life was controlled by their presence and how much she had to evade them. And I thought that was interesting because it's kind of changed so much. Like now there are more safeguards in place, especially with children, but she was before any of that occurred.
So they were building the narrative that we were absorbing at the time. And I think we were really young. So that for a lot of us was just, we were like, okay, this is what it is. This is the tabloids are telling us what it is and this is how it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happens is, especially with women in media, is that they sort of become characters. And it's very easy to forget that these are people, right? Because we start to consume them as media, as stories. And even as journalists, I think this is something that we have to really be vigilant about in ourselves. And Britney is a very clear example of that. For many years, she just became sort of this character, and she was talked about in these really sort of egregious ways, right? She was clearly having a mental health struggle, but instead it was she's out of control, she's partying, she's drunk. And then when she does this thing, which is she shaves her head, it's really in response to the fact that she's being hounded by the paparazzi. She's desperate to get away from them. And there's this moment where they're hounding her, and she goes into this like diner, and she's trying to like find just a moment to herself. And finally she can't, and she does this really dramatic thing. And the assumption is that, you know, she is suddenly doing this crazy thing because she's on drugs or whatever the sort of narrative is. But in some ways, the media is creating the narrative themselves, because they are hounding her to the degree that she cannot find a way to function in this world. She is with her children often when they are hounding her. So I really developed such an empathy for her that I didn't have, you know, at the time, because at the time I consumed it like everyone else consumed it, right? Sort of the way that people are consuming this Kate Middleton story now,
yes.
right?
I wanted, because Princess Di.
Like fun gossip, but this is like a person, right? This is a person's life. And I'm not saying that I don't indulge in that sometimes, but it is important when it's happening to sort of ask yourself, what would this be like if this was a man? Like if a man needed to take a couple months off for a surgery, would the reaction to it be the same? Would they be treated with the same sort of intrigue and this idea that they're like being hounded? And then this thing where she had to put out this statement saying that she does photoshopping in her spare time. I mean, it just seems there is like a real gendered quality to the way people are obsessing about her. And we see that over and over again in these stories in the podcast.
It is interesting now, though, because, you know, what's been said is that the British media actually has been yes, she's getting hounded. And of course, we all have conspiracy theories about it. But the British media has been better about it, I think, now than they were about Princess Di, right? And so I would love to hear your thoughts about just the comparison of then versus now.
I do think they've gotten better about it. In general, I think there has been more backlash to paparazzi. So there is an improvement to some degree. And the laws in England are really different. So they do have to be a little bit more careful around the royals. Like, I think a lot more speculation is happening in the US media than is happening in the British press, because they have a little bit more guardrails around the kind of rampant speculation that we do here, that our First Amendment laws really allow. So I think, you know, there is some improvement, but what happens is that even with those improvements, there are these moments in culture where people still get their narrative flattened in ways that we don't always realize we're doing, right? I mean, Meghan Markle is another example of this. I think in a lot of ways, people see Meghan Markle as a character, and they have a hard time seeing her as a person who was actually trying to navigate this very complicated family. And so when they talk about her sort of as this like character, as opposed to a person who is flawed, you know, who is going to make mistakes, but we all make mistakes, right? I mean, that's sort of what we're looking at in the podcast. It's not just to look at what happened to these other women, but to sort of ask ourselves why they resonate with us. Like for me, I feel a lot of empathy for a lot of these women because I've made a ton of mistakes myself, and they weren't in the glare of a national spotlight. Imagine being Britney's age and having that kind of attention on you. It would be, you know, really overwhelming. And I'm glad I got to make all my mistakes in the shadow of darkness.
And you mentioned growing up and absorbing culture and not always having cable. You didn't have cable, so you're watching a lot of like the WB and CW and really just this like gutter television that I also love. And I still love, by the way. I'm not above like a Real Housewives marathon. I love all those things because
I have a theory about The Real Housewives, which everyone dismisses as just like trash, but it's really a woman's workplace drama. How many other shows do they gather 5 very strong, opinionated women and then just give them the hour to do whatever they want? Like, we just don't have that many spaces for women like that. So it's not all just trash. There are trashy elements to it. I'm not going to deny that. But there are things to learn about the world from these shows and these things that we consume.
Well, I can't wait for the Real Housewives episode and for the Royal Family update episode comparison. Susie Banikarim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Finally tonight, the Grammy-winning Takish Quartet has been performing for nearly half a century, currently comprised of violinists Edward Dusenberry and Harumi Rhodes, cellist Andre Schfeir, and violist Richard ONeal. The band recently joined Jim Braude and Marjorie Egan on Boston Public Radio at the BPL to share the physics behind their music and a sampling of their new work.
Now joining us is Richard ONeal, one of the 4 members of Takish, and Harumi Rhodes. Welcome to you both. It's great. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. Can I say one thing?
What?
As great as the sound is, I say this all the time about live music, watching you play is almost as wonderful as listening to you play. It's so different when you're in the presence of the musicians. So Richard, I think we learned that Andras and Edward have been playing together 31 years. How long have you two been part of this?
I'm the newest newbie.
How new is new?
June of 2020, and I think Harumi was in 2018.
2018.
So how long does it take for new players to mesh as beautifully as you just did with 2 people who've been playing together for a long time, Harumi?
I mean, there's so many ways to answer that question. I think we had kind of a whole mixture of things going on. Richard and I have been playing together for also over 20 years.
You have?
We've known each other for a long time. We were classmates, and
Where?
We both went to Juilliard.
We did.
And we also spent some summers at the Marlborough Music Festival and toured together and did lots of fun projects together. So it's a small classical music world, in case you didn't notice. And we've all intertwined and played together in the past. But to really gel together as a group, it takes time on one hand, but on the other hand, you really learn on the job. You learn on stage. And so that's what makes it so fun, I think.
So tell us, Richard, about flow. I understand this is supposed to be something about what it sounded like at the beginning of the universe, like the Big Bang, and before and right after the Big Bang.
Yes, Tula has a divinity degree from Harvard, and she has a lot of amazing interests, and she spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out I think the assignment was the natural world. What we're going to play for you today is the 3rd movement. So the 1st movement deals with the Big Bang. This 3rd movement is a quark scherzo.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I don't even know what a quark is.
Please?
You got to explain to the non-physics people what a quark is.
Well, a violist trying to explain physics.
How about 2 radio talk show hosts trying to understand physics? So go ahead.
The literal translation of a scherzo was a joke, so let me go ahead. In physics, I believe a proton is made up of 2 up quarks, 2 positively charged quarks, and 1 down quark. And a neutron is made up of 2 down quarks and 1 up quark.
So what piece of flow are you playing for us?
We're going to play the 3rd movement, the quark scherzo.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
It's great to meet you both.
Thank
Want to rejoin your colleagues?
That's it for tonight. Come back tomorrow for Talking Politics. Congressman Seth Moulton on his new call for a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Plus, what separates the personal from the political as Governor Maura Healey faces criticism for keeping the details of some out-of-state travel private. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thanks for watching. I'm Tori Bedford. Good night.